Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Short Story, a very short introduction, by Andrew Kahn, narrated by Mike Cooper. Publisher's note. In this audio edition, you will hear references to visual elements present in the print and e-book formats of the book. Preface. When the Canadian author Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013, the first to be awarded to a writer exclusively of short stories, she commented, "I would really hope this would make people see the short story as an important art, not just something you played around with until you got a novel. If the genre looks like a poor, albeit loved, literary relation to the novel, that may reflect a widespread belief that anyone can tell stories, because, as a species, we're hardwired to invent or tell them." When asked what it took to make plot, characterization, description, and prose come together satisfactorily, Munro answered, "Hard work," and spoke of a more difficult job than she expected, a comment that dryly balances out both the expectation that telling stories should come naturally and that telling stories is a highly skilled craft. Figure 1. The job of defining theoretically and practically what the short story is has become harder, because the genre has been raising its game for well over a century and also gone global. For much of the 20th century, there was a commonplace view that the lives of their people inclined certain national literary traditions, above all the Irish, Americans, and Russians, to excel in the form. Bibliographies from the 1930s to the 1980s are rife with titles promoting the story as a proxy for national history. Frank O'Connor's The Lonely Voice, a seminal work of criticism by a great practitioner of the short story, was also emphatic about the connection between the genre and Irishness. His argument was largely class-based, holding that peoples who had suffered social exclusion, whether through poverty or colonization, provided a pool of marginal characters, or in Russian, the little people, best suited to short narratives. "A national art form," says Richard Ford. "The blessed Irish genre," says Joyce Carol Oates, although Anne Enright, an anthologist as well as short story writer, clearly sees the notion that there is an Irishness to stories written in Ireland as bluff. Once nourished by rural themes, even the Irish story has grown to encompass city dwellers, as can be seen in Chapter 5's discussion of a story by John McGahan, and much more diverse populations as well as the Irish diaspora. There's been a related perception that, despite its great tradition of the novel, English writers have been less successful as story writers. That view has been tackled head-on by A.S. Byatt in the introduction to her Oxford Book of English Stories, and readers can turn to collections by Julian Barnes, Claire Louise Bennett, and Francis Leviston's acclaimed The Voice in My Ear, or any of the 3 volumes edited by Philip Hensher, to see the myth of English uninterest vigorously belied by a cross-generational spirit of innovation gripping the form across centuries in the 1900s and the 2000s. But more generally, globalization and translation have opened up and stimulated other traditions. It may be the compact scale of the form, necessarily shorter than the novel, that gives the genre its cosmopolitan passport. The short story has come to be seen as a universal type of fiction, well suited to an age of world literature and notably engaged with social reality, including gender and ethnic issues, themes of substance that survive linguistic and cultural translation, especially well in a globalized world. Figure 2. The definition of short story writing in national or geographic terms, for example as American, Russian, English, Irish, South American, has in recent decades yielded to an internationalized market. One indicator of change can be found in the work published in the New Yorker magazine. Unrivaled in the longevity and distinction of its commitment to the form, a cradle of the great mid-century British and American tradition and home to fabled names such as Capote, Welty, Spark, Cheever, Trevor, and many others, the magazine remains an active incubator for the best of short story writing. From at least the 2000s, the magazine has broken out of what had, perhaps, fossilized into a special type of New Yorker story, sometimes lampooned as plotless, albeit superbly written, into a space that is culturally more diverse and mainstream. International anthologies are just as prominent as national ones, and when a national anthology appears, it can be far from parochial. For example, the Penguin Book of Italian short stories is edited by Jhumpa Lahiri, an American author born in London of Bengali parentage, now living in Rome. For authors and readers alike, plot was once the be-all and end-all. In the age of the magazine, treated in Chapter 1, stories were generally written to formula to please with a neat twist, leading to criticisms that plot had achieved a mechanical regularity. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspaper layout determined the word count of a story. As tales found outlets in quality reviews, anthologies, and eventually single-author collections, they became stories, generally longer and more crafted, without nevertheless becoming wannabe novels. The shape of the story has been continually reworked to explore inner and outer realities through linkages of psychology and motivation, situation and history, character and destiny. Serious writers of literary short stories, like practitioners of serious novels, are able to create the illusion that their characters are independent agents, free to make their choices outside the plot-driven choices of the author. Their stories express the complex relation of human identity and individual situation to the world, subjected to the norms of the art. It seems usual to define the short story by comparison with the novel, and above all to give priority to length as the thing that distinguishes the two. A short story is not a short novel, nor is it merely a joke. Attempts have regularly been made to draw distinctions between the sketch, anecdote, and novella, and there have been further strenuous efforts to differentiate the long short story from the novella. How short is short? In J.D. Salinger's The Laughing Man, a story partly about being told an adventure tale, the embedded narrative is described as having a classic dimension because it tended to sprawl all over the place, and yet it remained essentially portable. In Helen Garner's Postcards from Surfers, a character makes the point about the relaxation of the classical containment and symmetry of plot construction when she comments, "Sometimes my little story overflows the available space, and I have to run over onto a second postcard. This means I must find a smaller, secondary tale or some disconnected remark to fill up card number 2. The length of short stories mentioned and treated in this book extends, at the shorter end, from about 20 words to about 8,000, probably the upper limit on any definition before we hit the short novel or novella. The point about size and focus can be illustrated by thinking about two much anthologized American stories, each about a single incident, that illustrate expectations about size defined either as, on the one hand, length or number of pages or words, and, on the other, unity of event that moves the boundary from short toward long short story. Dorothy Parker's Here We Are captures a pair of newlyweds setting off on their honeymoon by train. Nervous about their first night together, they discover, as they chat, more points of difference than agreement, and then draw back from their smart aleck barbs into civility. The story leaves much unsaid as the characters spar out of sexual tension. Their conversation is the entire story, and about as long as a single section of William Styron's The Long March, an account of a brutal military exercise held over a period of 36 hours. The narrative is also about a single incident, but Styron uses its scale to build portraits of his two main characters, locked in enmity and seen through the eyes of a more neutral narrator. The restriction of the short story to single incidents, whether banal or moments of poetic intensity, is the traditional strength of unity of action that Edgar Allan Poe, a pioneer in the genre, identified as essential to its practice. Unity more than scale is a defining criterion. Elizabeth Bowen, the much-admired Anglo-Irish author of nearly a dozen separate collections, maintained that stories, unlike novels, are a matter of vision rather than feeling, by which she meant that the vision is complete in itself. This has something in common with the appreciation of one critic for how Edith Wharton, in her stories, removed the veils that are spread over most lives and, by want and custom, concealed the inner workings from the eyes of all but a few. It is the privilege of the artist to penetrate their enveloping folds and scan the bare souls within. There was no subject beyond Italo Calvino's playful imagination and gift for formal invention, whether in the novel or in the 12 short stories on sci-fi themes he published in 1969 as Cosmic Comics. When writing about his experience of the Second World War as an adolescent, Italo Calvino created a trilogy of realist stories over a unitary form. The transition from adolescence to youth might have been a theme for a novel, but the linked stories, all featuring the same protagonist, permitted a gradualism to the self-portrait, each story modulated according to its own state of mind and its own rhythm. There are states of being and mind, such as rapture, loneliness and grief, where the short story, like the poem, is proportionally suited to emotional intensity. Another example of a book serving as an umbrella for separate but linked accounts is Yuko Tsushima's Territory of Light, a touching feminist Japanese narrative influenced by Tennessee Williams' work of a single mother and daughter, first published as separate chapters and then as the novel. All these examples give proof of Helen Simpson's claim that the short story form is particularly good for uncomfortable or edgy subjects. And, incidentally, they indirectly expose O'Connor's argument about the class of short story protagonists as more valid observation than iron rule, since none of the protagonists in the works just mentioned qualifies as down and out. Stories can also achieve larger vistas as parts of a cycle or thematically linked book. In the 6 books of stories written about the Soviet labor camps, the Russian master Varlam Shalamov, whose influences include Chekhov, Maupassant and Proust, brought together dozens of stories, the shortest being a prose poem of a single page, the longest rarely exceeding 15 pages, all set in the bleakest of worlds. And while few characters survive across the entire Kolyma tales, the stories share recurring themes such as the meaning of work, the feeling of hunger and cold, treachery and hope, and are on such a scale that individual convicts stand for types and types gain individuality. Part and whole can therefore stand separately and cumulatively, or sequentially, as in the case of John Updike's 18 Maple stories, which capture marriage, American style, starting in the 1970s by telling the histories of a single couple, Richard and Joan Maple, over 20 years, or the 7 stories about the struggles of black women that Gloria Naylor united as The Women of Brewster Place, arguably more cycle than novel. The present book is not a potted history of the genre, nor is it a book strictly speaking about rules or an endorsement of a total theory of the short story. Through some survey, and mainly close reading of stories that have a representative quality, it explores how a set of forms, structures and themes common to the genre across national boundaries combine and recombine to give the genre a protean life. It aims, furthermore, to suggest how, within such a brief compass, the short story can achieve big things like imitating reality, bringing characters to life, intimating universal concerns, elaborating and revising social and gender stereotypes, offering comic relief, and delivering an emotional experience. Chapter 1. The Rise of the Short Story. The rise of the short story from the industrial age occurred largely in the context of British and American print culture. That development traces a long arc from the establishment of the genre as a staple of 19th century newspapers and magazines to its autonomy as a mode of literature held to be on a par with the novel. In the 19th century, globally, from Australia to Russia, the short story catered to the taste of growing readerships for entertainment, and its brevity and easy supply appealed to editors. Readers and publishers alike were avid for lively incident that could be compressed into the short space of 1 or more columns on a page. The account in this chapter, moving from the 19th century magazine origins of the short story to its debated status in the literary field, reminds us of its popular origins, its style and low prestige dictated by the literary marketplace before a new appreciation of the form's intrinsic possibilities eventually attracted artistic ambition and earned it critical value. Read all about it. Newspaper stories. Massive growth in readerships for newspapers and magazines, owing to the availability of cheap paper and advances in printing, was a global phenomenon in the 19th century. While the period also saw the increasing professionalism of authorship, storytelling was a popular phenomenon. For much of the 19th century, readers could find short fictions as well as true life tales, first on the pages of newspapers and later in magazines that increasingly carved out a niche for fiction. The word story often signified any narrative, real or invented, in the American, British and French periodical press. What mattered most in placing a story in print was its shape, beginning, middle, end, and believable and familiar content, recital of matters of fact, use of materials already employed, as the Bath Chronicle put it. Readers liked the boundary between fiction and non-fiction to be porous, narrative to be carried by the voice of the storyteller, and interest sustained by topicality. Tales recounted from experience were the stock in trade of magazines and newspapers, including eyewitness accounts of exotic travels or brave exploits. Whether the incident reported was experienced directly by the author or overheard, the reader had to believe in its occurrence. As early as the 1820s, the English author Elizabeth Inchbald, already admired for her novels, saw her collections of tales praised in the Literary Examiner for a singularly direct power of narrative which carries forwards the incidents, and her compactness of conception in character and plot. Hot off the presses applied nearly as much to tales of the everyday as it did to actual news stories. At 8 a.m. it lay on Giuseppe's newsstand, still damp from the presses, is how the ever-popular O. Henry began his classic A Newspaper Story. The American Ladies' Magazine, which boasted of its original tales, was typical in printing stories like The Mechanic's Wife, about a transaction between a shopkeeper and a housewife getting by on credit. Content crossed borders of different kinds. Over 2 issues in November 1869, the Saturday Evening Post printed The Disappearance of John Ackland, a shocker by Robert Bulwer-Lytton that had originally appeared in Charles Dickens's magazine All the Year Round. On its republication, it carried in bold type the tag, A True Story. The pool of authors was swollen by amateurs, presumably lured by the attraction of being in print, since publishers kept fees low. Edgar Allan Poe earned a modest $4 or $5 per page. Eventually, as advertising enhanced their revenue, magazines would pay authors more. Republication was one way to respond to the need for content. Many newspapers in Britain and the United States even expanded their offering of fiction by providing periodic roundups of short stories published elsewhere. The Caledonian Mercury of January 1840, for example, surveyed recent short story publications not only from competitors but from anthologies such as Bentley's Miscellany, singling out Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue because it completely floored our gravity. Republication was a regular occurrence in American magazines until 1845, when copyright laws offered domestic, but not international, authors protection. A world away in thinly populated Australia, readers depended on foreign imports for novels, yet newspapers did commission stories from Australian authors, both short and mostly longer, and well over 7,000 short fictions have been identified in the country's 19th century newspapers. These stories reflected Australian life, including sometimes positive portrayals of Aboriginals in defiance of colonial stereotypes. Entertainment was an important factor. No one doubted that life was stranger than fiction, and readers were hooked on reading all about it. Lurid stories, stylized as Gothic tales, regularly featured. In local newspapers, these could be sightings of ghosts by residents. In more established organs of the press, such as the Derby Mercury, accounts were more impersonally dressed up as literature. Stories of a Bride, under the byline by the author of A Mummy, offered the reader a total experience of horror-struck expressions, gloom, apprehensions, all felt by the heroine Adelaide, who, in the tale's final line, is saved by a bandit. Effect matters more than veracity, provenance, or unity of construction, as the opening paragraph states. It is not of much importance what vehicle is used to introduce a series of tales. We therefore hasten, without examining the one which gave the present work its title, to give an interesting scene from one of the Stories of a Bride, called The Treasure Seeker. The heroine, after journeying through a forest in order to approach the prison of her husband, is at length dismayed by the scenes in which she finds herself and sinks in despair. In a similar vein, a notice in The Examiner in 1827 observed a fashion for a certain romantic class of fiction, often expressed in national tales, under discussion with the Irish Tales of the O'Hara family. These featured action scenes and displays of honour. The Saturday Evening Post, originally founded in 1821 and by 1909 America's premier weekly, reproduced a series of accolades from other newspapers about its thrilling stories for the family circle. Ruddiman Tales and Sketches, an anthology excerpted in the press, was so bold as to claim that, when well told, books of short stories had many advantages over novels, owing to a greater variety of subjects, compressed within narrower limits. A zeal to publish inspired travel, crime and adventure stories, their fictionality uncertain. Captain Marryat's tales, like Gulliver's, are treated as true after the fashion of Homer, according to the Examiner. It is supposed, or it is a fact, that certain travellers, an English merchant, a botanist, a Spanish poet, a French surgeon, and others, formed a little institute of their own, and, meeting periodically at each other's rooms, amused themselves with the production of monthly stories. In 1841, a correspondent to the Saturday Evening Post opined that, owing to the genre's brevity, the best writers generally will not write short stories. They consider it a waste of time. Nathaniel Hawthorne notoriously lamented that the public taste is presently occupied with trash. By that time, the genre had begun to outgrow the modest number of columns newspapers could allocate, and stories began to follow principles relating to their own artistic composition, less dependent on either oral storytelling or journalistic reporting. The increase in the number of American periodicals that began before the Civil War meant that they reached diverse readerships, from farmers to professionals. Post-bellum growth was far more rapid, thanks to increasing literacy and mechanization of the printing press. Thousands of new periodicals tapped into a large audience of women and children. Sales figures appear to confirm the general thinking that female readerships had a greater appetite for fiction. For example, the Ladies' Home Journal, founded in 1883, would reach a circulation of about 2 million by 1912. From the late 19th century until the mid-20th century, the short story increasingly became a staple of magazines that diverged according to quality and readership either into elite publications, called slicker magazines or slicks because of their glossy paper, and pulp magazines designed to provide cheap thrills. The rivalry between the two trends would itself become a source of comment as the short story, as both a money spinner and an artistic form, gained credibility with editors and authors. The short story in pulp magazines. In the USA, pulp magazines flourished from the 1920s to 1940s, only to be mostly finished off by a paper and staple shortage during the Second World War, conditions that favoured the survival of more expensive literary magazines. The originator of the pulp magazine was Frank Munsey, who set up as a publisher in New York in the 1880s and made his millions by the 1900s, publishing mass fiction in Munsey's and Argosys. His winning formula that the story is more important than the paper it is printed on worked thanks to a supply of cheap wood pulp paper and a new high-speed printing process. He aimed to beat the weekly newspapers that had treated popular literature as fringe. The polar opposite of quality magazines, slicks like Harper's and Scribner's, which were highbrow and more expensive, the pulp magazines, like their earlier British equivalents, the Penny Dreadfuls, catered to a mass readership avid for the thrills of action plots full of intrigue, highly sexed men and women, and sometimes violence, available and even affordable during the Depression at a rock-bottom price between 5 cents and a quarter. This was the period when the private eye, born in the 1920s, grew into the fictional heroes of Prohibition, hard-nosed loners, only just on the right side of the law, who populated the stories of thrilling detective, 10 detective aces, and popular detective, figure 3. For 10 cents, Dime Detective provided 12 action-jammed stories. No thrills were better than cheap thrills, and no genre more adaptable than the short story to a variety of plot stratagems. Each weekly normally contained 128 pages and about 120,000 words, with vivid and shocking artwork inside and on the cover. They encompassed a variety of styles or subgenres of sleuth fictions, detective stories, including confessions, thrillers, adventure, such as westerns, sci-fi and horror, in which nothing could be too breathless, as in the melodramas of Dime Detective in the 1930s, or too frivolous, as in the twice-monthly Saucy Stories, or too lurid, as in works featured in spicy mystery stories like Robert Bellam's Death's Nocturne or Arthur Wallace's Dungeons for the Blind, or too fantastic, as in the zombies, vampires and voodoo to be found in Tales of Magic and Mystery, or too hard-boiled, the specialty of the cynical sleuths featured in The Black Mask, whose readership apparently included President Woodrow Wilson. As in 19th century newspapers, the pulps also ran true stories, and detective tales had true-life features like the column The Crime Clinic. Munsey's publications included some of the most successful titles, such as Adventure, Amazing Stories, Black Mask, Famous Fantastic Mysteries, Ghost Stories, Marvel Science Stories, Oriental Stories, Spicy Mystery Stories, Terror Tales, and Weird Tales. And they spawned many competitors, most notably the Clayton magazines, publishers, among many other crime pulps, of Clues, a magazine of detective stories. Many stories were standalone, but the magazines also retained their clientele by running serials that reliably delivered to a specific fan base. Detective Story magazine, which preferred the amateur gumshoe to the hard-boiled sleuth, ran for 30 years as one of the most successful magazines in American history and featured a veritable roll call of crime fiction. The Argosy All-Story Weekly in the 1920s was a pulp magazine that targeted children, before finding a more lucrative readership in the 1940s with men's adventure pulp tales and true crime. Susan Glaspell, a popular short story writer, and the true crime pioneer Earl Stanley Gardner both contributed. The Nick Carter magazine in the 1930s set a boyish detective hero of the 1910s well on his way to becoming the secret agent of the 1960s. The usually highbrow writers H.L. Mencken, later famous as a doyen of American grammar, and George G. Nathan, who had already published The Smart Set, a mixture of gossip and fiction for high society, lost their scruples about the lousy quality and made real money when they began publishing Saucy Stories in 1915, and then The Black Mask, the most famous in the genre, with sales of over 200,000 copies weekly, the exclusive outlet for Carol John Daly's pioneering private eye, Race Williams, avatar of the even harder Dan Turner, star of Spicy Detective and Hollywood Detective magazine. Pulp traded in plot-driven thrills and spills, and its division into subgroups made it easy to market. Enduring quality was not an artistic imperative for editors of pulps, and the ranks of writers even included gangsters, recruited to write for True Gang Life, among other magazines, to add a whiff of notoriety. Nonetheless, the pulps attracted enduring talents such as the detective masters Dashiell Hammett and his private Dix, the Continental Op in 1923, and later Sam Spade, Raymond Chandler, who invented his first detective Mallory in 1933 and finished off his pulp writing in Black Mask with the celebrated Marlowe, a first-person narrator. Other famous names featured in pulps included the great weird story writer H.P. Lovecraft, the science fiction giants Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov, and adventure masters Edgar Rice Burroughs and Zane Grey. Even as late as the 1960s, the connection between social change and content remained immediate, as can be seen in a gay liberation readership for gay-inflected pulp fiction that boomed in that decade. Quality periodicals. The view that the short story served as newspaper fodder dogged its reputation from the start. A review in the Freeman's Journal of Tales of the Jury Room generalized that the machinery by which such collections of tales are introduced and connected together is exceedingly cumbersome and uninteresting, deploring the tangled plot. With the publication of stories in The Yankee magazine and in other periodicals such as Burton's Gentleman's magazine, of which he was assistant editor, Poe had begun from 1838 to garner a transatlantic reputation for stories appreciated as works of lasting imaginative and morbid power. They included pioneering criminal fiction, as well as more abstract works of symbolist and philosophical thought, many of which made it into his 1840 Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque. Poe's success was more the exception than the rule. In 1857, the critic of Little's Living Age, an American periodical, complained that Poe, while remembered nearly a decade after his death, was still sold as railway reading in cheap portable editions.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?